Tonight, opening the spigot. The U.S. set to release more oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve in an effort to combat high fuel costs. This as the war in Ukraine rages on, even with signs of Russian troops withdrawing from Kyiv. Plus, a wave of terror. Multiple deadly attacks strike fear in Israel. And prosecuting the police.
If I understand correctly, it effectively acts as a shield.
That's exactly right.
Why critics call qualified immunity an unlawful shield. All this and more tonight on Faith Nation. Drivers feeling the pain at the pump and a bold move by the White House to do something about it. Good evening in Washington, I'm Jenna Browder. President Biden announcing today a plan to tap into America's Strategic Petroleum Reserve, an unprecedented 180 million barrels of oil over the next 6 months. He says it's necessary as a record high inflation and Russia's war against Ukraine continue to drive up prices. So will it help? Capitol Hill correspondent Matt Galka joins us with tonight's top story. Matt?
Well, Jenna, the president and Congress are searching for ways to help drivers and their wallets at gas stations. Tapping into a historic amount of reserves could bring some relief, but when exactly prices will go down, still to be determined. President Biden announced his plan to go into the country's oil reserves and release 1 million barrels per day for the next 6 months.
The bottom line is this. Between ramping up production in the short term and driving down demand in the long term, we can free ourselves from our dependence on imported oil from across the world. Look, I know gas prices are painful. I get it. My plan's going to help ease that pain today and safeguard against tomorrow.
While drivers saw a little relief over the last week, gas prices only dipped by a penny. The national average now sits at $4.22 a gallon. Different ideas have been floating around Congress, including suspending the federal gas tax, an option not popular with House Speaker Nancy Pelosi.
That is immediate, and it has appeal. People understand it. There's going to be a reduction in the gas tax. That's the pro. The con is that the oil companies do not necessarily pass that on to the consumer. They haven't in the past.
While dipping into oil reserves could provide short-term relief, some point to potential long-term problems.
What this release will do is depress the incentive for the domestic investments we need to ratchet up our production here at home.
The Biden administration continues to blame Russia's war on Ukraine for high prices as the assault moves into the 6th week. These satellite images show how constant shelling has basically leveled the city of Mariupol. NATO remains skeptical that Russia will stick to its statement from earlier this week that military operations would be scaled back.
What we see is a continued military invasion of Ukraine. We see continued shelling of cities, and we see that Russia are repositioning some of their troops, moving some of them around.
Turkish officials plan to continue peace talks between Russia and Ukraine in the coming weeks as the humanitarian crisis grows and the squeeze on the global economy gets tighter. Now, the plan might be a tough sell to Americans. A new Quinnipiac poll has 41% of people blaming the Biden administration and its economic policies on high gas prices, with just 24% blaming the war in Ukraine and sanctions against Russia. Jenna?
Yeah, something said. NBC News poll reflected something similar recently. Matt, we know Russia's invasion of Ukraine has definitely driven up prices, at least some. But today the president also blamed oil companies, even threatening punishment.
Yeah, and part of the president's plan is he's pushing Congress to impose fees on oil companies not using wells on their leased land. The hope is to at least compel them to produce more oil or be hit with extra costs. But some analysts aren't really sold on that idea either.
All right. Capitol Hill correspondent Matt Galka, thank you very much. Well, Israel is on high alert tonight after a deadly full of deadly terror attacks. The latest, a bus stabbing this morning that has an Israeli citizen fighting for his life. As Chris Mitchell reports from Israel, today's attack comes after a week of fatal shootings.
On Tuesday night, a Palestinian gunman on a motorcycle opened fire in the crowded central city of Bnei Brak, killing 5 Israelis, including an Arab policeman. Israeli police said they managed to shoot the terrorists and prevent more deaths. It was the second mass shooting in days. ISIS claimed responsibility for an attack in the city of Hadera, where 2 Palestinian Arabs killed 2 and wounded 4. Earlier, an ISIS supporter killed 4 in a stabbing spree in the southern city of Beersheba that left 4 dead. In the past week, thousands of Israelis gathered in funerals around the country. Hundreds mourned a 19-year-old border policewoman killed in one attack, and Israel's education minister lamented the victims of another.
4 human beings who went out on their daily routine were brutally murdered in a murder campaign of a bloodthirsty murderer, only for the reason of them being Jewish.
To address the wave of violence, Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett called an emergency meeting of top security officials, and in a nationwide speech, he told Israelis that Israel would prevail over terror.
We face a challenging period. We have experience in dealing with terrorism from the very beginning of Zionism. They did not break us then, and they will not break us now.
Hamas praised the shootings in Bnei Brak as a heroic operation. And on Twitter, some in Gaza passed out candy to celebrate the killings. Hezbollah supporters in Lebanon danced in the streets and waved flags to celebrate the latest attack. The terror attacks come ahead of the Muslim month of Ramadan, where there is often a rise in terrorism.
Millions of Muslims actually enjoy the holiday peacefully. But here in Israel, unfortunately, we have radical forces who take advantage of this important religious holiday to incite against Jews and to promote violence.
A new Palestinian study revealed sobering findings about the future of Israeli-Palestinian relations. Nearly half of Palestinians polled said the most effective way to build an independent state was, quote, armed struggle. Only 25% chose negotiations. Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Jerusalem.
All right, thank you, Chris. And let's bring in Ellie Cohen, former Deputy Special Envoy to combat anti-Semitism. Ellie, welcome. So there's been a period of relative quiet in Israel. What do you think accounts for this sudden surge of violence we're seeing?
Jenna, we saw a historic summit in Israel on Sunday, the Negev Summit, which was an outgrowth of the Abraham Accords peace deals. We saw the foreign ministers of Egypt, of Morocco, of the United Arab Emirates, and Bahrain for the first time gathered on Israeli soil, hosted by Israel's Foreign Minister Yair Lapid, and with the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken there as well. And I believe that these radical forces want to stop the progression of Israel's peace with these Sunni Arab states. They want to stop everything that Israel is accomplishing in advancing itself and being integrated into the Middle East, North Africa region. So that could be possible, part of the motivation. I would say also that what was not helpful was when Secretary of State Blinken met with Mahmoud Abbas, he issued a statement afterwards in which he seemed to be equivocating Israel's expansion of settlements and demolishment of illegal construction by Arabs in the West Bank area with the Palestinian Authorities pay-for-slay policy, which is that they pay terrorists after they commit terror attacks against Israelis, or they pay for their family members' expenses for many, many years after the terrorist commits an attack if he gets eliminated in the operation. And it's unfathomable to me how the United States Secretary of State could possibly try to equivocate and make equal these two very different things.
This week, the State Department announced a new religious coexistence working group between the U.S., Israel, and the UAE. It's meant to promote interfaith dialogue and counter intolerance and hatred. What does this do, or what does it mean for the region, Ellie?
Well, it's a wonderful development, and I have to tell you, the Emiratis have been at the forefront of creating a culture of coexistence in their country. When I was a deputy envoy and I went to visit on official travel to the United Arab Emirates, I met with Emirati officials and I learned about how They had revised their curricula and they had revised their textbooks to remove anti-Semitic materials, anti-Christian, and they have really changed the culture of the country where they really don't tolerate extremism and radicalism. So I think the Emiratis are the perfect partner for this, and obviously bringing Israel as a partner also is a wonderful move, and this is something that I am very happy to see the U.S. State Department achieve. The question I think for all of us is whether we can actually see the fruits of this kind of labor if at the same time the United States is refunding UNRWA, which has textbooks that it teaches Palestinian children that is teaching them incitement and hatred towards Jews. So what I would like to see is the United States have consistent policies.
All right, Ellie Cohen, it's great to have you with us this evening. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Well, unemployment, inflation, and all things economy. Next on Faith Nation. And welcome back. After hitting historic lows, unemployment appears to be once again on the rise. New Labor Department numbers out today show jobless claims hit 202,000 last week. That's up 14,000 from the previous week, which saw the fewest claims since 1969. Some good news on the jobs front, though. ADP reports the private job sector gained 455,000 new jobs this month. Tomorrow, the Labor Department will release their March jobs report. And here now to discuss, Mark Hamrick, Washington Bureau Chief and Senior Economic Analyst for Bankrate. Mark, good to see you this evening. So unemployment slightly up. What do you make of this 14,000 bump, and is it something to be concerned about?
Hello, Jenna. Good to be with you. These new jobless claims are a measure of fresh job loss. And as you mentioned there, they remain historically low. The number of individuals who are receiving some form of unemployment benefit, the lowest levels in decades. We'll find out essentially within the next 24 hours where the unemployment rate stands. But if we get the move that is expected, and that is slightly below the previous month's level, down to 3.7%, that's getting very close to the lowest level in decades. Once again, we were at 3.5% just before the pandemic began. And as we know, in the latest count, more than 11 million job openings in the United States. That's almost 2 times the number of officially unemployed. So the job market still remains very tight, but there is concern that we may have almost no growth on an annualized basis in the first quarter that's just about to conclude. And we know that inflation is the #1 problem that's affecting the economy. It's affecting businesses and consumers in very significant ways.
Yeah, it's on a lot of people's minds, that's for sure. So tomorrow we'll get the March jobs report. The private sector numbers came out yesterday and were a little bit better than expected, companies adding some 455,000 jobs. What are you expecting to see tomorrow, Mark?
Well, the consensus is that we'll get something on the order approaching about 500,000 jobs added, and that would be below the pace that we've seen in terms of the monthly average over the past 12 months. But we probably are at the point where we should not expect that earlier pace to be sustained. And I might add, we just published a series of stories at Bankrate.com today on our quarterly survey of economists, and indeed they look for further moderation in hiring over the year ahead. The good news is, and we're always looking for good news these days, that the unemployment rate ought to remain fairly stable over the next 12 months. But there is one very significant cautionary note. Taken together, the 19 economists say the risk of a recession in the next 12 to 18 months is 1 in 3, and no one put that risk at less than 1 in 5. So this is something to continue to monitor. And of course, the Federal Reserve wants to push interest rates up as much as it sort of can over the next year and beyond to try to dampen inflation.
On inflation, the Fed's preferred inflation gauge rose 5.4% in March. That's the highest in nearly 40 years, Mark. What does that tell you about, where we are and where inflation could be going in just a few seconds?
It tells you keep the seatbelts fastened, because as high as that was, we're probably going to get some even higher numbers in the coming months once we get some of these impacts from Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the impacts those have had on prices reflected in these inflation data points.
All right, Mark Hamrick with Bankrate.com. It's always good to have you on the show. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jenna.
Was police brutality actually protected under law? the little-known doctrine that's shielded cops from prosecution. Next on Faith Nation. An unlawful shield for police. That's what the doctrine known as qualified immunity is being called. And today, House lawmakers heard testimony on why some say it needs to go.
So what is it? It's a defense that government officials can raise when they are sued for damages for violating the Constitution. It protects them from liability unless the law governing their conduct was clearly established. It is a judicially created immunity that stems from the Supreme Court's erroneous interpretation of 42 U.S.C. Section 1983. It's not in the statute or required by statute, and to be clear, it is not required by the Constitution.
Faith Nation anchor John Jessup has more on how qualified immunity makes it hard to prosecute the police for violating civil rights.
Anger over the haunting images of the death of George Floyd sparked a worldwide movement. But there's another movement, though little known, gaining traction, marked not by images, but by two words many have never heard: qualified immunity.
If I understand correctly, it effectively acts as a shield.
That's exactly right. And that's why we call qualified immunity an unlawful shield, because it is a shield for public officials who have committed constitutional violations to escape accountability for their actions.
When police use excessive force that may violate a person's rights, that person can try to recover damages by claiming a violation of civil rights. But increasingly, those claims are not even given their day in court because of the doctrine of qualified immunity and its widespread application in civil cases seeking police accountability. The law's origin comes from the Enforcement Act of 1871, designed to protect recently freed slaves after the Civil War. Over the years, a section of the law protecting public officials in the course of their work evolved into today's version of qualified immunity, a doctrine created by the Supreme Court. It essentially provides a shield of liability against civil lawsuits so long as the public official's conduct does not violate clearly established law.
The way it works in practice is that courts will require would-be civil rights plaintiffs to find a prior case already decided in their jurisdiction where someone else's rights were violated in essentially the same way.
And given no two cases are exactly the same,
qualified immunity routinely enables public officials, especially members of law enforcement, to get away with egregious misconduct just because they happen to be the first ones to commit that exact kind of misconduct.
For example, after being cleared of any wrongdoing, a Cleveland man filed a lawsuit alleging he was punched in the neck and jailed by police who never identified themselves but suspected he was breaking into his own apartment. A judge ruled because of qualified immunity, neither the police nor the city could be sued. And an appeals court in 2019 ruled two California police officers who allegedly stole over $220,000 while executing a warrant also couldn't be sued, simply because there's no legal precedent in that part of California.
What should happen when a
Schweikert isn't the only one drawing attention to the legal challenge. A Reuters investigation reviewed some 500 cases over 15 years and found a trend: courts denying victims the right to challenge violations of their constitutional rights, making it harder to win future cases against the police. In speaking with law enforcement, I found a willingness to reconsider the unintended effects of qualified immunity, followed by a hesitation to end the principle, seen as essential so police can carry out their daily duties without the constant fear of lawsuits. Captain Sonia Pruitt has served nearly 30 years with the Montgomery County, Maryland Police Department.
Black officers play a really vital role in policing. It is a noble profession.
As the head of the National Black Police Association, she says it's time to re-examine qualified immunity for law enforcement.
We would ask that any of the parameters surrounding qualified immunity be examined, because it could be a way for officers to feel like that they will get more leniency if they commit an act, a violation of misconduct in the line of duty.
Schweikert believes it not only thwarts justice, but works against the very men and women it's designed to protect.
I think that this doctrine is doing a tremendous disservice to members of law enforcement because it is depriving them of the public trust and credibility that they need to do their job safely and effectively.
And momentum for change is building. Among protesters honoring George Floyd, both liberal and conservative justices saying it's time to review the court's own solidified principle, and lawmakers introducing legislation to revoke the provision for gun-carrying officers in an effort to combat excessive force and police brutality. It's a rare issue of consensus across ideological lines. Nicole Porter witnessed the power of the faith community when she worked to advance the First Step Act.
In my work at the state level, faith communities are key in representing a base of constituents who are supportive of criminal justice reform and talking about restorative justice and other alternatives of punishment.
Many agree among the ways to honor George Floyd is to fix the broken system before it gets worse.
My hope is that if we are able to address that now and make a simple but massive change to eliminate this doctrine, I hope that that will offer some small measure of redemption for the death of George Floyd and so many other people like him.
What's his name? George Floyd! John Jessup, CBN News, Washington.
And still ahead, Italy has a new guardian. Meet the robot dog protecting its ruins. Finally tonight, protecting Italy's historic sites isn't easy, but new technology could be the key to keeping ancient structures in place for years to come. Meet Spot, the robot guard dog designed to protect Pompeii Archaeological Park. Using his 360-degree camera, the four-legged robot will patrol Pompeii at night, looking for structural issues and protect city streets from illegal relic hunters. Spot was created by Boston Dynamics here in the United States. And if you're in the market for a robot dog like Spot, you can buy a base model starting for just around $75,000. Have a great night.